Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Do Manage Lead the videos. My name is Nigel Argall. I'm the author of the book Do Manage Lead, Essential Tools for Christian Leaders. Today we're going to be looking at conflict. It's a really difficult, painful area. Most of us will have had experience of conflict. It might be in your family, probably in your workplace. We look out at the world and it's a big feature of life. Conflict is it's painful in itself. It's particularly painful for us if we are followers of Jesus. We are called to love our enemies. We find it difficult when we are in conflict with people, and we find it especially painful when we're in conflict with other believers, with other Christians. There is another side to conflict, though. Conflict is painful, it can be very difficult, but it can also actually be cathartic. It can be a way of clearing things up, of resolving injustices. That could be on a huge scale. William Wilberforce famously had to fight to end slavery, a lot of conflict, but he pushed through the conflict to get to a better result. It may well be that you've been in a situation, perhaps on a team, where somebody's not really doing their job well. Resolving it involves some conflict, but actually it brings everybody to a better place. So conflict is not good or bad, but what we're going to do in this video is just sort of unpack and map how a conflict might develop and how we can gain some understanding from that. As always, we're going to start with a Bible story. This is from Acts. So it's a super critical part of the history of the church. It's the early days. The church is sorting out who they are, what they believe, what their doctrines are. This is from Acts 15, just the first two verses. Some men came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the brothers, unless you're circumcised according to the customs taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. This brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debate with them. So Paul and Barnabas were appointed along with some believers to go up to Jerusalem to see the apostles and elders about this question. Now, to us, that may not sound like a big deal, but what we have to understand is in the context, this was an incredibly important dispute. The early church, there's really two sorts of believers. There's those that were converts from Judaism, so they were used to the idea of worshipping God through ritual observance, and that included the act of circumcision. But there were also the non-Jewish believers that had come in from all sorts of different spiritual backgrounds, who had no concept of the law, observance of the law, observance of ritual, didn't have that baggage and saw no need for circumcision. You can understand with those two completely different approaches the potential for conflict. Was this really something that all believers had to go through, or was this a bit of baggage that the Jewish believers had brought with them that was actually going to sort of derail the church that was really built on the idea of grace, that God's love is freely given through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the conflict curve, which maps the way most conflicts play out. Okay, what the conflict curve tells us, and this could be a conflict between friends, it could be a conflict on a team, a work team, it could be anything up to a war between two countries. It tells us that any conflict goes through some predictable stages. So I've got here, This is intensity here, intensity of the conflict, and this predictably is time along here. Okay, what are the stages? The first bit here is what we're going to call latent conflict. That's where the different sides, they are aware of the difference of opinion, difference of approach, whatever it is. At this point, quite a lot of time can go along. There's not a lot of conflict. It's largely hidden. It's bubbling under the surface, but it's there. What then happens is what's called the emerging stage here. The emerging stage of the conflict. And the shape of the curve's quite critical here. You notice that not very much time has passed, but a lot more conflict. It's starting to emerge. People are going to become much more aware of the different opinions. People are going to sort of recruit for their sides. If you've ever known about it, could be a conflict in your church, and people start coming up to you and going, well, whose side are you on? You know, people are sort of recruiting to their camp. There's a real sense of the emergence of the conflict. It's not hidden. It's not bubbling along under the surface. It's actually coming out into the open. The next stage here is escalation, and this is where it starts getting really serious. People are at some level, it may not be physical, but certainly people are really starting to fight each other. The conflict is absolutely out in the open. It's starting to become quite destructive. It's painful. You can't hide it. Even people not involved in the conflict are aware that it's going on. That will go on, and at some point the conflict doesn't get any, the time goes on, but the conflict doesn't escalate anymore. It kind of flattens off, and we're calling this section stalemate. That could be because both sides want to do something about it. It could be noble reasons. Actually, it could simply be that both sides are exhausted by the conflict. At this stage, it's incredibly destructive. People are getting hurt. People's lives are being damaged. It's an incredibly destructive and painful part of the conflict. Now, if there is intervention, we can actually start coming back down the curve here. So de-escalation, there's a kind of, this isn't resolving the conflict here. All we've done is we've said this is so painful, we need to kind of withdraw and start doing something about it. There's a de-escalation, both sides withdrawing, perhaps somebody is intervening as a peacemaker. There needs to be a lot of negotiation here. A lot of talking, a lot of listening to each other. As I say, very often will require a third party to come in as some sort of peacemaker. And finally, there'll be, hopefully, some sort of settlement and agreement at the end. Now, there's a couple of very, very important points about this. I use the word on this curve to describe it as it's descriptive, not prescriptive. Now, what I mean by that is simply this. If we don't do anything, that is probably the shape of the conflict curve. That is what is going to happen. But it doesn't have to be like that. Here's the insight. If we can recognize what is going on at any point on the conflict curve, we can cut across. The earlier we intervene, the easier it is to cut across, and the less rebuilding there needs to be done on the other side of the curve. There's a very interesting aspect here for those of us that are Christians. As Christians, particularly when we find ourselves in conflict with other Christians, we're often very uncomfortable about that, and we tend to be in denial. My experience is, certainly with Christians, we're often further up this curve than we want to give ourselves credit for. So there's a real insight there, recognizing what is going on. The sooner we recognize what is happening, the easier it is to cut across to the other side. Incidentally, also because we're Christians, we often like to try and rush this bit here. You can't do that. De-escalation, people are still in pain at this stage. There needs to be a lot of sharing, a lot of listening. This takes time. The negotiation takes time. People need to be brought to a point of empathizing and understanding the other person's point of view. And finally, I'm not a great believer in what I call Hollywood endings. Now, what I mean by that is, yes, there are some fantastic examples of people who have been through painful disputes and have got to a great situation where they can live with each other. actually sometimes the best we can hope for is a negotiated split. We go our separate ways, but it's still been worth going through this just to resolve the dispute. Okay, let's go back to that super critical moment in the history of the church in the book of Acts, and let's see what happened. Here we are in Acts 15, reading from verse 5. Then some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said, "The Gentiles must be circumcised and required to obey the law of Moses." The apostles and the elders met to consider this question. After much discussion, Peter got up and addressed them. "Brothers, you know that some time ago God made a choice among you that the Gentiles might hear from my lips the message of the gospel and believe. God, who knows the heart, showed that he accepted them by giving them the Holy Spirit, to them just as he did to us. He made no distinction between us and them, for he purified their hearts by faith. Now then, why do you try to test God by putting on the necks of the disciples a yoke that neither we nor our fathers have been able to bear? No, we believe it is through the grace of our Lord Jesus that we are saved, just as they are." I'm going to skip on to verse 19. "It's my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should write to them, telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood. For Moses has been preached in every city from the earliest times, and it's read in the synagogues on every Sabbath." Finally, from verse 24. "We've heard that some went out from us without our authorization and disturbed you, troubling your minds by what they said." That may seem quite a complicated story around the dispute, but I just want to bring a couple of points to your attention. Right there back in the first verse, the Pharisees are being completely uncommitted. It says the Gentiles must be circumcised, must obey the law. They are pushing their point of view. There genuinely is a real dispute here. Paul and Barnabas have kind of walked into a theological hornet's nest. They're easily halfway up the conflict curve at this point. Note that it takes time. It says in verse 7, after much discussion. Remember I said there's no shortcuts. Both sides need to listen, both sides need to wrangle, they need to know that they've been heard, that their point of view is accepted. People will often accept a difficult decision if they know that they have been genuinely listened to and genuinely understood. There's been a sharing of views, a sharing of facts. One side does win. It's the grace theology that wins, but what's critical here is that the other side have been listened to and the whole process has not been rushed. Okay, that's the conflict curve. I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. The first is a health warning. The value to us as Christian leaders, whether we're thinking about a dispute in our church, our home group, on a professional team, or whatever it is, the value of the conflict curve is to understand and map what is happening. And so many times I have brought this into a meeting, and it helps people to articulate their feelings, their thoughts, to explain where they feel they are on the conflict curve, and that helps resolution. Here's the health warning. In and of itself, getting our heads around the conflict curve does not make us professional peacemakers. That is a skilled job. The value of this to us is to work out what is going on, but very often conflicts are so serious we need a good third party to come in. To be a peacemaker is a skilled job, it's a dangerous job. When you start peacemaking, you may be fired on by both sides. It's a tough place to be. That may or may not be your gifting. But the value is to work out what is going on. You may need to ask for help. What we need to do as leaders, though, is to see what is going on, to map it, and if necessary, to have the courage to make an intervention. Remember that probably the biggest single lesson from the conflict curve is the earlier we see what is going on, the easier it is to cross over to the other side, and the less work it requires to bring some sort of lasting peace. As always, if you want to explore this in a little bit more detail, get a copy of the book. There's a lot more reflection, a lot more detail, a lot more Bible stories. If you haven't got one of these, check out the link below. Bless you in your peacemaking.